Adam's vibrant world of sound and color had vanished, replaced by silence and shadow. Miles away, Lena battled a city's relentless noise and her own gnawing anxiety. Their paths converged in a forgotten bookstore, a haven where a blind musician and an insomniac librarian would unknowingly begin to compose a shared harmony, finding solace in unexpected stillness. The scent of decaying paper was Adam's primary color, a musty, yellow-brown fragrance he breathed in place of sight. It was the smell of his inheritance, his prison, his world. Finch and Sparrow books, a relic left to him by a grandfather he barely remembered, was less a business and more a mausoleum for stories. By day, its sagging shelves and dusty, silent spines repelled the city's frantic energy, admitting only the occasional lost tourist or determined academic. But the nights belonged to Adam. After the heavy oak door was bolted, the satisfying thud of the lock sliding home was a signal, sealing him off from the world that had become a landscape of hazards and pity. The bookstore transformed. It became his sanctuary, his memory palace. A flash of chemical fire in a workshop 2 years ago had extinguished the light in his eyes, and with it, the vibrant, chaotic symphony of his synesthesia. Before, he had been a sought-after piano tuner, his hands not just calibrating strings but coaxing life from them. He was also a composer, his mind a canvas where C-sharp was the crisp, russet fire of an autumn maple, and a diminished seventh chord tasted of bitter, dark chocolate. Now all the colors were gone. His only conduit to that lost, vibrant world was a small, clattering braille embosser. On stiff sheets of cardstock, he painstakingly punched out the melodies that haunted him, desperate to give them form before they dissolved into the gray, formless void of his memory. The raised dots under his fingertips were a clumsy, mechanical translation of a language his soul once sang fluently. He was 28, but the grief had aged him, carving lines of quiet resignation around his mouth. Miles away, in a sterile fourth-floor apartment, Lena was being hunted by the city's frantic pulse. A research librarian by trade, her mind was a fortress of order and quiet cataloging, but at night, that fortress crumbled. Insomnia, fueled by a relentless, gnawing anxiety, was her tormentor. The wail of a distant siren, the guttural rumble of the late-night train, the muffled bass from a neighbor's party, each sound was a physical assault. Tonight was particularly bad. Fleeing her bed, she pulled on a coat and walked, with no destination other than away. It was on a narrow, forgotten side street, slick with a fine mist, that she saw it. A single, unwavering beacon of amber light in a window, a soft glow that seemed to absorb the noise around it. The sign above, barely legible, read Finch and Sparrow Books. It looked closed, yet it promised a silence she craved more than sleep. Hesitantly, she reached for the cold brass handle. To her surprise, the door was unlocked. It swung inward with a soft groan, releasing a wave of that ancient, papery scent. The single amber lamp on a far counter cast long, distorted shadows, turning the towering bookshelves into silent, watchful giants. A young man sat behind the counter, his head bowed in concentration, his hands moving with a strange, rhythmic purpose. One hand slid slowly across a sheet of paper, while the fingers of the other tapped out a silent, complex rhythm on the dusty mahogany. He didn't look up. He didn't seem to notice her at all. Lena felt a pang of guilt, an intruder in a private ritual. She almost retreated, but the profound, almost sacred quiet of the space held her fast. It was a silence unlike the dead quiet of her apartment. This was a living silence, thick with the weight of a million sleeping words. She slipped into a worn leather armchair in the darkest corner, sinking into its cracked, cool surface. She didn't come to buy a book. She came for this, the stillness. Her visits became a ritual of their own. Every night around 1 a.m., she would slip through the unlocked door and take up her post in the armchair. Adam never acknowledged her presence, and she, in turn, never made a sound. She learned the rhythm of his nights. She watched as he meticulously, almost tenderly, dusted a section of shelves, his hands mapping the terrain of his domain. But always he would return to the counter and to his papers. Over the weeks, her librarian's curiosity began to piece the puzzle together. The machine he sometimes used, with its distinctive clack-clack-clack, was a braille embosser. The papers held not words but music. She realized he wasn't just reading, he was composing or perhaps remembering. His fingers, gliding over the raised dots, were reading a score, and his other hand, drumming silently on the wood, was the orchestra. He was playing the music in his head, a silent symphony in a silent room. A profound sense of connection resonated within her, a strange kinship with this blind keeper of forgotten stories. She, who was trapped in a prison of internal noise, found solace in watching him build a world from silence. His dedication was a quiet rebuke to her own frantic, sleepless despair. He wasn't just surviving his darkness, he was creating within it. And in his silent, persistent act of creation, Lena felt a sliver of her own relentless anxiety begin, finally, to recede. The night the storm broke was the night everything changed. A sudden, violent thunderstorm slammed into the city, the kind that rattled window panes and made the sky feel like a cracked plate. The percussive blasts of thunder echoed through the bookstore, each one making Adam flinch as if from a physical blow. Lena, huddled in her armchair, watched him. His usual focused calm was gone, replaced by a raw, frayed tension. His hands, usually so steady, fumbled with his stack of braille scores. A particularly vicious clap of thunder, directly overhead, made him jump. The stack of papers slid from the counter, scattering across the dusty floorboards like fallen leaves. A sharp, frustrated sigh escaped his lips, the first sound Lena had ever heard him make, besides the clatter of his machine. For a moment, she remained frozen. Her nightly pact of silence felt inviolable. But seeing the papers strewn around his feet, seeing the tremor in his hands as he knelt, fumbling blindly to retrieve them, broke the spell. She rose from her chair, her own heart thumping a nervous rhythm. "Let me help," she said, her voice softer than she intended, yet it sliced through the sound of the rain lashing against the windows. Adam froze instantly, his head snapping up in the direction of her voice. He looked like a startled animal, his body coiled with a sudden, defensive energy. "Who's there?" he demanded, his tone sharp with suspicion. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to frighten you." Lena knelt, her hands carefully gathering the stiff sheets. She felt the raised dots under her own fingers. I come here sometimes. At night, it's quiet." She placed the stack gently back onto the counter beside him. He remained tense, his face a mask of distrust and wounded pride. He hated this, the sudden awareness of being watched, the clumsy intrusion, the offer of help that always felt like pity. Lena sensed it immediately. She didn't ask about the papers, didn't mention his blindness or the silent music. Instead, she drew on her own truth, the reason she was there in the first place. "The storm is loud tonight," she said, her voice finding the calm, steady cadence she used for frightened freshmen in the university library. "If you don't mind, could I read to you? Just for a little while. Sometimes a good story is the best shelter from a storm." The offer was so unexpected, so completely unrelated to his immediate frustration, that it disarmed him. It wasn't an offer of help for his blindness, but a shared remedy for the storm that raged both outside and, for him, inside. He stood there for a long moment, the tension slowly draining from his shoulders. Finally, without turning his face to her, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That single nod became an unspoken covenant. Lena returned to her armchair, but instead of sinking into the silence, she reached into her tote bag and pulled out a worn paperback. It was a collection of travel essays she'd been meaning to read for months. She began to read, her voice a clear, steady thread weaving through the tapestry of the storm. She read about the ochre-colored dust of a Tuscan road, the dizzying scent of a Moroccan spice market, the impossible, crystalline blue of a Greek island cove. Adam remained behind the counter, motionless at first. He had expected to be annoyed, to feel the intrusion chafe at his solitude, but Lena's voice was not intrusive. It was calm, measured, and devoid of pity. It was simply a voice telling a story. As she read, something remarkable began to happen inside his mind. The words, stripped of their visual context for him, became pure sensation. The ochre-colored dust wasn't a sight, but a feeling. A warm, sun-baked grittiness he could almost feel on his skin. The dizzying scent of the spice market bloomed in his memory, a phantom symphony of cinnamon, cumin, and saffron. For the first time in 2 years, his imagination began to paint with color again, not with light but with sound. The warmth of the Tuscan sun became a gentle, sustained chord in C major. The chaotic energy of the spice market translated into a flurry of staccato notes and complex, syncopated rhythms. He was no longer just remembering old melodies. He was hearing new ones, born from the world her voice was building for him in the dark. The ritual was established. Every night Lena would arrive, and after a few moments of shared silence, she would begin to read. As a research librarian, she had an endless reservoir of worlds to offer. One night, it was a gripping sci-fi novel about bioluminescent creatures in the crushing depths of the Marianas Trench. Adam heard the deep, mysterious drone of a D minor chord, punctuated by glittering, high-pitched arpeggios that mimicked the flashing lights of the deep-sea fauna. Another night, she read a hard-boiled detective novel set on the grimy, rain-slicked streets of 1940s Chicago. Adam's silent countertapping became a cool, smoky jazz riff, the melody weaving like a lone figure in a trench coat through foggy alleyways. His braille embosser began to clatter with a new urgency. He was no longer just preserving the past. He was capturing the present, transcribing the music her stories awoke in him. The grayness of his world was being filled, note by note, with the texture and color of her voice. And for Lena, the act of focusing entirely on the narrative, on delivering the words for her audience of one, became a powerful form of meditation. In the act of giving Adam a world, she was, for a few precious hours each night, escaping the noisy prison of her own mind. After nearly 2 months of these nightly readings, a new kind of composition had taken shape in Adam's mind. It wasn't a fragment or a fleeting motif, but a complete, cohesive piece, a tapestry woven from the threads of her voice. It was a nocturne, a piece born of darkness, but it was filled with the colors he had found in her stories. It had passages that swelled with the warmth of a Tuscan sun, descended into the mysterious blue depths of the ocean, and skittered with the nervous energy of a city street at midnight. It was a tribute, a thank you, a story told back to its teller in the only language he had left. One evening, as Lena was packing her bag to leave, Adam spoke, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the comfortable silence that usually followed a reading. "There's a piano," he said. "In the back storeroom. It was my grandfather's, an old upright. It hasn't been played in maybe 15 years. Lena paused, her hand on her coat. The statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She didn't know what to say, so she just waited, listening. "I think," he continued, a note of nervous resolve in his tone, "I need to tune it." For the next week, Lena's readings were accompanied by a new, intermittent soundtrack. From behind the closed storeroom door came the strange, discordant sounds of a piano being brought back to life. The sharp ping of a single string being struck, followed by a pause, then the faint, metallic groan of a tuning pin being turned. Ping, groan, ping. Adam was working entirely by ear, his sense of pitch, sharpened by his blindness, navigating the complex interplay of harmonics and vibrations. He was relying on muscle memory and an auditory acuity he hadn't tested on an acoustic instrument in 2 years. To Lena, it sounded like a slow, painful, but determined awakening. She imagined him in there, his head cocked, listening with an intensity she could barely fathom, battling the ghosts of dissonance, one string at a time. Then, on a Friday night, after she finished the final, poignant chapter of a book about a lone Arctic explorer witnessing the aurora borealis, the storeroom door creaked open. Lena, Adam's voice was different. It held an invitation, a tremor of vulnerability. "Would you come in?" She rose and followed his voice into the storeroom. It was a dragon's hoard of forgotten things, towering stacks of unsorted books, shrouded furniture that looked like sleeping beasts, boxes of brittle, yellowed ledgers. A single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling cast a soft, golden light, turning the dust motes dancing in the air into a silent, glittering galaxy. In the center of the room, cleared of debris, sat the piano. It was an old, dark-wood upright, its finish scarred with the nicks and scratches of a long life. It looked less like a piece of furniture and more like a noble elder, waiting patiently to speak. Adam was already seated on the worn bench. He took a deep, steadying breath, a silent moment of communion with the keys. Then his hands, which Lena had only ever seen tapping silently or sliding over braille, found their true purpose. His fingers fell onto the ivory, and the first notes of his nocturne filled the cramped, dusty space. The sound was richer, more resonant than she could have ever imagined. It washed over her, a wave of pure, unadulterated emotion, and she recognized it all. There was the soaring, open melody of the travel essays, the deep, resonant chords of the ocean's abyss, the playful, syncopated rhythm of the detective's chase, and a final, shimmering passage that sounded exactly like the northern lights she had just described. It was her voice, her stories, transformed into something new, something breathtakingly beautiful. It was the sound of a soul breaking free from its cage, a talent long dormant bursting back into vibrant, astonishing life. The final, shimmering chord, an echo of the aurora borealis, hung in the dusty air for a long moment before gently fading into the profound silence of the storeroom. The only sound left was the soft hum of the old incandescent bulb. Adam's hands remained resting on the keys, his shoulders slightly slumped, not in defeat, but in the deep, cathartic exhaustion that follows a true act of creation. He had poured all the frustration, all the darkness, and all the newfound color of the past 2 months into that performance. For the first time since the accident, he felt not like a man defined by what he had lost, but by what he could still create. He turned his head slightly in the direction of the armchair he'd heard her pull into the room. He was nervous, desperate for her reaction, for some sign that she understood what he had tried to say with his music. "Lena," he asked, his voice barely a whisper. There was no answer. A flicker of his old insecurity returned. Had she left? Was the music too much, too raw, too personal? "Lena," he repeated, a little louder this time, a note of anxiety creeping into his tone. He was met only with the steady, rhythmic sound of a soft, even breathing. He focused, listening past the thumping of his own heart. It was the sound of deep, untroubled sleep. He pictured her, the woman who had filled his silent world with stories, finally succumbing to the peace she had so generously given him. Slowly, a smile spread across Adam's face. It was a real smile, the first in years, one that reached his eyes even if they couldn't see. He realized then that his music hadn't just been for him. He had composed a piece to reclaim his own world, and in doing so, he had inadvertently composed a lullaby for hers. The quiet librarian who had battled the demons of insomnia had been vanquished not by struggle, but by a melody born of her own kindness. In that moment, their shared solitude had transformed into a perfect, reciprocal act of healing. The light he had lost had found a new way to shine, illuminating not just his path, but hers as well. A few months later, Finch and Sparrow Books was still a quiet, dusty place, its commercial fortunes unchanged. But the atmosphere of despair had lifted, replaced by a quiet, creative hum. It was no longer a mausoleum, but a studio. With some of her modest savings, Lena had bought a simple set of microphones and a laptop. Together, they began to record Adam's new compositions. They named that first piece, the one born from the storm and the stories, The Librarian's Lullaby. With a little help from a tech-savvy student at Lena's library, they uploaded it to a small, independent music-sharing platform. There was no grand record deal, no sudden fame. But slowly, organically, the song found its audience. It was shared between insomniacs on late-night forums, added to playlists titled Quiet Night and Study and Sleep. The comments were a testament to its gentle power. "This helped me through a panic attack," one read. "It's 3 a.m. and I'm finally feeling calm, thank you." Adam and Lena's lives had found a new, shared rhythm, a quiet harmony built in the space between spoken words and played notes. Their two solitary worlds had merged, creating a small, warm universe of their own, right there, among the sleeping books.